Hi, welcome back. So in our previous video, we discussed about proof of work, how proof of work works, what is the underlying consensus algorithm that proof of work uses in order to secure their network. And we discussed that a lot of cryptocurrencies and blockchain projects like Bitcoin and Ethereum, which uses enormous amount of energy solely because of them using the proof of work concepts, right? However, before we move to the proof of stake, let's discuss more about proof of work, where exactly it came from and what was the need for that. So proof of work concept came in around 1993, and the original purpose of proof of work was to combat junking even. However, the technique largely remained unused till 2009 when Satoshi Nakamoto came up with the white paper Bitcoin. And he was the first person who realized that this can act as a consensus mechanism to secure the Bitcoin blockchain, right? So the proof of stake algorithm is driven by the impact of the proof of work. As we know that on the blockchain network, miners, whoever has the better infrastructure, will be able to mine more and get more rewards, right? So you need better computing power. So anyone with a better infrastructure is essentially going to get more rewards because they will be able to crack more codes in order to get those blocks, and they will be the one who will be adding those blocks back to the blockchain. So as a result, miners across the world, what they did is that they're now collaborating in order to create miner pools, right? Where what they do is that they basically go ahead and they share the computing power and then distribute the coin or a token evenly. And this leads to some sort of a centralization of coin among group of miners, which is basically against the spirit of the blockchain. So if we'll go to the mining pool, and if you see here, what is essentially happening is that if you see around 4 or 5 mining groups, which include the Ant Pool, the Bixin, the BTC.com and BTC.top, if they come ahead and they collaborate in order to create another bigger pool, we will end up having, say, majority of 51%, and then they will have that power of even processing, fraud transaction or invalid transactions. So these were, say, certain issues with the proof of work. And again, another issue that we had discussed earlier was the amount of electricity that is being consumed. So another report, it suggested that only the Bitcoin network, the amount of electricity that is consumed in order to process all those proof of work, can go ahead and say provide electricity to 5 million US households. Now, this is too much of power consumption, right? And similarly, even it can go ahead and can provide electricity to countries like Hungary or New Zealand, right? And with all these issues around proof of work, what we needed was another algorithm, right? So we needed a new algorithm. So in order to solve these issues with proof of work, a Bitcoin user in 2011 named Quantum Mechanics came up with a white paper called as proof of work, proof of stake instead of proof of work. And the idea in this was that the miners on the networks that are competing against each other is a waste of resource. Instead, in proof of stake, what they will be doing is that we will have randomly chosen node to act as a validator, right? So here the term validator becomes important because in proof of stake we have validators, not miners. Validators are again called as forgers as well, and what the process of validating a transaction or processing a transaction is not mining, but basically minting or forging, right? So this is what the main difference in between the proof of work and the proof of stake is. Now, how are validators selected? Now, before the selection of validators is concerned, now any node that has to act as a validator and have to join any network like Bitcoin or Ethereum, they will have to deposit certain tokens, right? So if I want to act as a validator in any network, I can join that network, but I will have to deposit certain tokens around, right? Now these tokens, one can basically categorize them as, say, security deposit, right? So these acts like a security deposits on. Now the size of the deposit is something that is going to determine the chances that the node has in order to forge the next block, right? So if you see this particular example, here this is a very specific graph where Dave has basically deposited $10 and Sophie has deposited $100. Now, when it comes to randomly selecting any validator in order to forge any block, the chances of Sophie getting that option of basically validating that transaction is 10 times higher in comparison to that. In comparison to do. Now, this might seem that proof of stake favors the rich. However, in economy of scale, proof of work favors rich even more, right? So the reason for is that in proof of stake, the at a scale, it basically have a say straight line. That because even suppose if I want to add more tokens as a deposit in order to get more favor, that one token will still cost me $1. However, on economy of scale, say 1 kilowatt of electricity, which is the essential element in the proof of work, will cost $1. However, on scale, say 1000 kilowatt of electricity will cost me $800, right? So on scale, the richer will have better advantages in proof of work rather than proof of stake. Also, proof of stake, to get started with proof of stake, you do not need very high cost infrastructure because we are not going to have those complex algorithm that we have to crack in order to get those blocks. So now let's look into how the proof of work works. However, before that, there is one specific question: is that can we say trust the validators on the network? I mean, how is the fraud basically prevented on the network? So what happens is that once a node is chosen to validate the transaction in the block, the node validates it and then adds that block to the blockchain, right? As a result of this validation, the validator receives the fees associated to transaction fee that is there in the transactions inside that block. So, again, coming back to the question, can we trust the validators? No. Now that's where the stakes come in. So you remember that each node will have to deposit certain, say, stake or a token in order to become part of that network. So now suppose if a validator validates fraudulent transaction, then what happens is that they lose part of the stake deposited in the network. So for example, if there is 100 token that they have deposited, and if they are validating any transaction, say if they are validating any fraud transaction which is of value, say $5, right? So now that can be verified by everyone on that network, and essentially the end balance of that validator will be 100 minus 5, which will be, say, 95 tokens, right? So if every time they are validating a fraud transaction, it is being deducted and they lose their deposit out. So if the value of the stake, now if the value of the stake is higher than the value of the transaction that is being validated, validator will lose more than they validated for a fraudulent transaction, right? So this has a check and balance. Now once suppose the validator stops validating, what happens then? Then the deposit and the transaction fees earned by forging the block is released after a certain period of time. But why not straight away? I mean, suppose if I want to get out of the network, why not give the token back to the validator straight away? Now this is because the network needs time to validate and punish for any fraudulent transaction that might have been validated, right? So you remember I discussed that in proof of work there is no penalty for fraudulent transaction. However, in proof of stake it does have that check and balance. So let's see what are the major differences in between proof of work and proof of stake. that in proof of work, the process of processing a transaction, it basically depends on the mining capacity or the computational power and that entire expensive infrastructure. However, validating capacity depends on the stake in the network. So higher the stake, the more the chances that I will be getting a chance to forge a particular block. Miners receive block reward to solve a cryptographic puzzle. Validator do not receive any block reward. Instead, what they do is they collect transactional fees as a record. Now, in case of proof of work, hackers would need to have a computational power of more than 51% of the network to add any malicious block, which is also called as 51% attack. Now, this is hypothetically very, very expensive because I mentioned in say proof of work infrastructure, that entire node setup and the cost is going to be in billions of dollars. And I mean, practically it might not be financially feasible to go ahead and add a specific malicious block into that network. And as far as the proof of stake is concerned, hackers would need to own 51% of the cryptocurrency on the network, which is practically impossible. And why it is practically impossible is that if you consider that on peak, say Bitcoin has a market cap of around $1 trillion. Now 51% of a $1 trillion will eventually turn out to be $510 billion, right? So I mean, that is humongous amount. I mean, it's such a big amount that for one entity to own this much amount of token on a particular network is almost impossible. And that what makes 51% attack on networks like Bitcoin and Ethereum, which is their market cap is so huge, under proof of stake, financially unviable. Now, what are the pros and the cons? Now, we have discussed in the pros and cons that for proof of stake, we do not need all those big infrastructure. We do not have to spend too much money, on setting on those mining farms and all. So those comes as the pros of proof of stake. Another pros of proof of stake, as I discussed, that on economy of scale, the proof of work tends to favor the richer more in comparison to the proof of stake. Now, what are its cons? Now, major con that I just discussed is that it is vulnerable to that attack. Hypothetically, 51% attack won't be possible in a big market cap like Bitcoin and Ethereum, but in smaller market cap with token value being very, very less, that might be one of the vulnerabilities that proof of stake concept have. The second issue with proof of stake is that suppose in case a block is basically assigned to any validator. Now, what happens if the validator is not available at that time in order to process that transaction? And that can basically slow down that entire process as well. However, even this case can be encountered by having enough backup validators. So suppose if someone with more favorable chance who has got that block to forge, if that is not available, then it can go to the less next favorable person, whoever is chosen by the network. Now, what are the POS powered projects? There are a lot of different proof of stake powered projects. The first one is Peercoin, NXT. Even Ethereum has one project called as Casper. And of course, there are a lot of other projects also like Cardano and all. So this is all about proof of stakes. Thanks.